Hey everybody, what's up? I'm Jason Kishinev. You're watching A People's Historian. We are in the middle of chapter 15 of A People's History of the United States. And let's just pick up from where we left off. Buried in the general news of prosperity in the 20s were, from time to time, stories of bitter labor struggles. In 1922, coal miners and railroad men went on strike, and Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana, a progressive elected with labor votes, visited the strike area and reported, "All day long I have listened to heart-rending stories of women evicted from their homes by the coal companies. I heard pitiful pleas of little children crying for bread. I stood aghast as I heard most amazing stories from men brutally beaten by private policemen. It has been a shocking and nerve-wracking experience." A text. This is Hermione. This is what, her fourth or fifth video. A textile strike in Rhode Island in 1922 among Italian and Portuguese workers failed. But class feelings were awakened and some of the strikers joined radical movements. Not in my face, babe. Luigi Nardella recalled, "My oldest brother Guido, he started the strike. Guido pulled the handles on the looms in the Royal Mills, going from one section to the next, shouting, 'Strike! Strike!' It's okay. When the strike started, we didn't have any union organizers. We got together a group of girls and went from mill to mill, and that morning we got 5 mills out. We'd motion to the girls in the mills, 'Come out, come out.' Then we'd go on to the next. Somebody from the Young Workers League came out to bring a check and invited me to a meeting, and I went. Then I joined, and in a few years I was in the Risorgimento Club in Providence." I'm not familiar with that word. "We were anti-fascists. I spoke on street corners, bring a stand, jump up and talk to good crowds, and we led the support for Sacco and Vanzetti. After the war with the Socialist Party weakened, a Communist Party was organized, and Communists were involved in the organization of the Trade Union Education League, which tried to build a militant spirit inside the AFL. When a communist named Ben Gold of the Furriers section of the TUEL, or is it TUFL? TUEL, challenged the AFL union leadership at a meeting, he was knifed and beaten. But in 1926, he and other communists organized a strike of furriers who formed mass picket lines, battled the police to hold their lines, were arrested and beaten, but kept striking until they won a 40-hour week and a wage increase. That is brutal. And that's how we got a 40-hour work week, huh? Communist unions, more power to you, man. Strengthen the unions. We gotta strengthen the unions. They've been weakened so much. Communists again played a leading part in the great textile strike that spread through the Carolinas and Tennessee in the spring of 1929. The mill owners had moved to the South to escape unions, to find more subservient workers among the poor whites. But these workers rebelled against the long hours, the low pay. They particularly resented the stretch-out and intensification of work. For instance, a weaver who had operated 24 looms and got $18.91 a week would be raised to $23, but he would be stretched out to 100 looms and had to work at a punishing pace. The first of the textile strikes was in Tennessee, where 500 women in one mill walked out in protest against wages of $9 to $10 a week. Then at Gastonia, North Carolina, workers joined a new union, the National Textile Workers Union, led by communists, which admitted both blacks and whites to membership. When some of them were fired, half of the 2,000 workers went out on strike. An atmosphere of anti-communism and racism built up and violence began. Textile workers began to spread across South Carolina. One by one, the various strikes were settled with some gains, but not at Gastonia. There, with the textile workers living in a tent colony and refusing to renounce the communists and their leadership, the strike went on. But strike breakers were brought in, and the mills kept operating. Desperation grew. There were violent clashes with the police. One dark night, the chief of police was killed in a gun battle, and 16 strikers and sympathizers were indicted for murder, including Fred Beale, a Communist Party organizer. Ultimately, 7 were tried and given sentences of from 5 to 20 years. They were released on bail and left the state. The communists escaped to Soviet Russia. Through all the defeats, the beatings, the murders, however, it was the beginning of textile mill unionism in the South. The stock market crash of 1929, which marked the beginning of the Great Depression of the United States, came directly from wild speculation, which collapsed and brought the whole economy down with it. But as John Galbraith says in his study of that event, behind the speculation was the fact that the economy was fundamentally unsound. He points to very unhealthy corporate and banking structures, an unsound foreign trade, much economic misinformation, and the bad distribution of income. The highest 5% of the population received about 1/3 of all personal income. We got some maldistribution of income now. A socialist critic would go further and say that the capitalist system was by its nature unsound, a system driven by the one overriding motive of corporate profit, and therefore unstable, unpredictable, and blind to human needs. The result of all that, permanent depression for many of its people, and periodic crises for almost everybody. Capitalism, despite its attempts at self-reform, its organization for better control, was still in 1929 a sick and undependable system. After the crash, the economy was stunned, barely moving. Over 5,000 banks closed and huge numbers of businesses unable to get money closed too. Those that continued laid off employees. Those that continued laid off employees and cut the wages of those who remained again and again. Industrial production fell 1/4 or 1/3 of the labor. Industrial production fell by 50%, and by 1933, perhaps 15 million. No one knew exactly. 1/4 or 1/3 of the labor force were out of work. The Ford Motor Company, which in the spring of 1929 had employed 128,000 workers, was down to 37,000. Was down to 37,000 by August of 1931, which was, just 2.5 years. By the end of 1930, almost half the 280,000 textile mill workers in New England were out of work. Former President Calvin Coolidge commented with his customary wisdom, "When more and more people are thrown out of work, unemployment results." He spoke again in early 1931. This country is not in good condition. So he was famous for no-brainers. Clearly, those responsible for organizing the economy did not know what had happened, were baffled by it, refused to recognize it, and had found reasons other than the failure of the system. Herbert Hoover had said not long before the crash, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." Henry Ford in March 1931 said the crisis was here because the average man won't really do a day's work unless he is caught and cannot get out of it. There is plenty of work to do if people would do it. A few weeks later, he laid off 75,000 workers. There were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it, to sell it. Warehouses were full of clothing, but people could not afford it. I'm sorry. There were lots of houses, but they stayed empty because people couldn't pay the rent, had been evicted, and now lived in shacks in quickly formed Hoovervilles built on garbage dumps. Brief glimpses of reality in the newspapers could have been multiplied by the millions. A New York Times story in early 1932. After vainly trying to get a stay of dispossession until January 15th from his apartment at 46 Hancock Street in Brooklyn yesterday, Peter J. Cornell, 48 years old, a former roofing contractor, out of work and penniless, fell dead in the arms of his wife. A doctor gave the cause of his death as heart disease, and the police said it had at least partly been caused by the bitter disappointment of a long day's fruitless attempt to prevent himself and his family from being put out on the street. Cornell owed $5 in rent in arrears and $39 for January, which his landlord required in advance. Failure to produce the money resulted in a dispossess order being served on the family yesterday and to take effect at the end of the week. After vainly seeking assistance elsewhere, he was told during the day by the Home Relief Bureau that it would have no funds with which to help him until January 15th. A dispatch from Wisconsin to the nation in late 1932. Throughout the Middle West, the tension between the farmers and the authorities has been growing as a result of tax and foreclosure sales. In many cases, evictions have been prevented only by mass action on the part of the farmers. However, until the Sichon homestead near Elkhorn, Wisconsin was besieged on December 6th by a host of deputy sheriffs armed with machine guns, rifles, shotguns, and tear gas bombs, there had been no actual violence. Max Sichon's property was auctioned off at a foreclosure sale last August, but he refused to allow either the buyer or the authorities to approach his home. He held off unwelcome visitors with a shotgun. The sheriff called upon Sichon to submit peacefully. When he refused to do so, the sheriff ordered deputies to lay down a barrage of machine gun and rifle fire. Sichon is now in jail in Elkhorn, and his wife and 2 children who were with him in the house are being cared for in the county hospital. Sichon is not a troublemaker. He enjoys the confidence of his neighbors, who only recently elected him Justice of the Peace of the town of Sugar Creek. That a man of his standing and disposition should go to such lengths in defying the authorities is a clear warning that we may expect further trouble in the agricultural districts unless the farmers are soon helped. A tenement dweller on 113th Street in East Harlem wrote to Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia in Washington, "You know my condition is bad. I used to get pension from the government and they stopped. It is now nearly 7 months I am out of work. I hope you will try to do something for me. I have 4 children who are in need of clothes and food. My daughter, who is 8, is very ill and not recovering. My rent is due 2 months and I am afraid of being put out. In Oklahoma, the farmers found their farms sold under the auctioneer's hammer. Their farms turning to dust, the tractors coming in and taking over. John Steinbeck, in his novel of the Great Depression, The Grapes of Wrath, describes what happened. And the dispossessed, the migrants, flowed into California, 250,000 and 300,000. Behind them, new tractors were going on the land, and the tenants were being forced off, and new waves were on the way. New waves of the dispossessed and the homeless, hard, intent, and dangerous. And a homeless, hungry man driving the road with his wife beside him and his thin children in the back seat could look at the fallow fields which might produce food but not profit. And that man could know how a fallow field is a sin, and the unused land a crime against the thin children. And in the south, he saw the golden oranges hanging on the trees, the little golden oranges on the dark green trees, and guards with shotguns patrolling the lines, so a man might not pick an orange for a thin child. Oranges to be dumped if the price was low. These people were becoming dangerous, as Steinbeck said. The spirit of rebellion was growing. Moritz Hallgren, in a 1933 book, Seeds of Revolt, compiled newspaper reports of things happening around the country. England, Arkansas, January 3rd, 1931. The long drought that ruined hundreds of Arkansas farms last summer had a dramatic sequel late today when some 500 farmers, most of them white men and many of them armed, marched on the business section of this town, shouting that they must have food for themselves and their families. The invaders announced their intention to take it from the stores unless it were provided from some other source without cost. Detroit, July 9th, 1931. An incipient riot by 500 unemployed men turned out of the city lodging house for lack of funds was quelled by police reserves in Cadillac Square tonight. Indiana Harbor, Indiana, August 5th, 1931. 1,500 jobless men stormed the plant of the Fruit Growers Express Company here, demanding that they be given jobs to keep from starving. The company's answer was to call the city police, who routed the jobless with menacing clubs. There's quite a few of these. Boston, November 10th, 1931. 20 persons were treated for injuries. 3 were hurt so seriously that they may die, and dozens of others were nursing wounds from flying bottles, lead pipe, and stones after clashes between striking longshoremen and Negro strikebreakers along the Charlestown, East Boston waterfront. Detroit, November 28, 1931. A mounted patrolman was hit on the head with a stone and unhorsed, and one demonstrator was arrested during a disturbance in Grand Circus Park this morning when 2,000 men and women met there in defiance of police orders. Chicago, April 1st, 1932. 500 school children, most with haggard faces and in tattered clothes, paraded through Chicago's downtown section to the Board of Education offices to demand that the school system provide them with food. Boston, June 3rd, 1932. 25 hungry children raided a buffet lunch set up for Spanish War veterans during a Boston parade. 2 automobile loads of police were called to drive them away. New York, January 21st, 1933. Several hundred jobless surrounded a restaurant just off Union Square today, demanding that they be fed without charge. Seattle, February 16th, 1933. A two-day siege of the county city building, occupied by an army of about 5,000 unemployed, was ended early tonight. Deputy sheriffs and police evicting the demonstrators after nearly 2 hours of efforts. Yip Harburg, the songwriter, told Studs Terkel about the year 1932. I was walking along the street at that time and you'd see the bread lines. The biggest one in New York City was owned by William Randolph Hearst. He had a big truck with several people on it and big cauldrons of hot soup, bread. Fellows with burlap on their feet were lined up all around Columbus Circle and went for blocks and blocks around the park waiting. Harburg had to write a song for the show Americana. He wrote, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" And I think this is the song, but I don't know the tune. I apologize for my ignorance. Once in khaki suits, gee, we looked swell, full of that Yankee doodle-dee-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell. I was the kid with the drum. Say, don't you remember they called me Al? It was Al all the time. Say, don't you remember I'm your pal? Brother, can you spare a dime? It was not just a song of despair. As Yip Harburg told Terkel, in the song the man is really saying, I made an investment in this country, where the hell are my dividends? It's more than just a bit of pathos. It doesn't reduce him to a beggar, it makes him a dignified human asking questions, and a bit outraged too, as he should be. The anger of the veteran of the First World War, now without work, his family hungry, led to the march of the Bonus Army to Washington in the spring and summer of 1932. War veterans holding government bonus certificates which were due years in the future demanded that Congress pay them off now, when the money was desperately needed. And so they began to move to Washington from all over the country, with wives and children, or alone. They came in broken down old autos, stealing rides on freight trains or hitchhiking. They were miners from West Virginia, sheet metal workers from Columbus, Georgia, and unemployed Polish veterans from Chicago. One family, husband, wife, 3-year-old boy, spent 3 months on freight trains coming from California. Chief Running Wolf, a jobless Mescalero Indian from New Mexico, showed up in full Indian dress with bow and arrow. More than 20,000 came. Most camped across the Potomac River from the Capitol on Anacostia Flats, whereas John Dos Passos wrote, the men are sleeping in little lean-tos built out of old newspapers, cardboard boxes, packing crates, bits of tin or tar paper roofing, every kind of cockeyed makeshift shelter from the rain scraped together out of the city dump. The bill to pay off on the bonus passed the House, but was defeated in the Senate, and some veterans, discouraged, left. Most stayed, some encamped in government buildings near the Capitol, the rest on Anacostia Flats, and President Hoover ordered the army to evict them. 4 troops of cavalry, 4 companies of infantry, a machine gun squadron, and 6 tanks assembled near the White House. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the operation, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower his aide. George S. Patton was one of the officers. A lot of big names there. MacArthur led his troops down Pennsylvania Avenue used tear gas to clear veterans out of the old buildings and set the buildings on fire. Then the Army moved across the bridge to Anacostia. Thousands of veterans, wives, children, began to run as the tear gas spread. The soldiers set fire to some of the huts, and soon the whole encampment was ablaze. When it was all over, 2 veterans had been shot to death. An 11-week-old baby had died. An 8-year-old boy was partially blinded by gas. 2 police had fractured skulls. And 1,000 veterans were injured by the gas. The hard times. The inaction of the government in helping. The action of the government in dispersing war veterans. All had their effect on the election of November 1932. As you would imagine it would have an effect on an election. Democratic Party candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover overwhelmingly, took office in the spring of 1933, and began a program of reform legislation which became famous as the New Deal. When a small Veterans March on Washington took place early in his administration, he greeted them and provided coffee. They met with one of his aides and went home. It was a sign of Roosevelt's approach. And that'll be the end of this episode. We'll call it there. Pick it up on the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you tune in for the next part of the chapter. And I hope you hit that like and subscribe button. Hit the notification bell as well, and you'll be notified when I do make the next video. See you next time.